and welcome to episode 126 of Silver Lining for Learning. We're going to talk about 3 decades of insights from the Escuela Nueva School Model. And the founder of that model is here with us today to describe it, to tell us what's happened, to tell us what's going to be next, maybe. So Vicky Colbert has won several awards, these wise prizes, because she's a wise person who thought of this idea. And we'd like to hear a little bit about the model of the school, about the startup. Let's start where it began. Let's start in the incubation side. What led you to design or think about designing this model, maybe with other people who are around you, and who, if it was co-founded with others, who were those people that helped you design it, and what was their role? What was your role, and how long did it take for this to catch on? Because it's in a number of schools, like 20 countries last I read, or so. Let's get back to the starting point, and then we'll take it fast forward later on in our questioning. Vicky?
Well, yes, thank you very much, Kurt. Well, Escuela Nueva, which means new school in Spanish, is not so new anymore because it's one of the longest bottom-up innovations of the developing world that's still being sustained. And I think that's very important because we have lessons learned from why it's still being sustained. And it's nothing new in the philosophy of education. But when we started, there were Colombia, like the rest of Latin America, did not guarantee universal primary education. This was in the mid-70s. So it was not only Colombia, it was all Latin America. Why? Because there were many isolated, rural, I say invisible schools to most educational planners. And our geography in Colombia is quite, it's complicated and complex. So there are many really isolated small schools scattered all over the country that are invisible. But these rural, isolated, multi-grade schools, like in everywhere in the world, even in the US in the last century, the Little Red House in the Prairie, one teacher had to handle simultaneously several grades. First, second, third, fourth, and fifth grade, just a sole teacher. And there already existed, there was a UNESCO experience trying to help teachers learn to handle this situation because it was not easy. So the first thing I did when I started, first of all, I had a wonderful mother. She was always a teacher. She was always talking about active learning. Nothing new. I've heard about these things for so many, many years. But I myself personally had the opportunity of going to a good quality school. So I started, the first thing was to compare what opportunity I had and to see the schools that children were having in the rural areas of Colombia, and that they were not having the opportunity to complete their primary education. So as a sociologist originally, I'm totally convinced that without quality basic education, nothing can be achieved. Social development, economic development, cultural development, nor peace, nor environmental issues, nor social climate. So I wanted to work in basic education because that's where for me was the most important part. So I had my mother's example, my own conviction, and the importance of having quality basic education. Now, I'm also convinced that without quality basic education, we cannot reduce inequity in the system. Latin America is a continent with a lot of inequity. So I wanted to sort of highlight 3 words: quality, equity, and democracy. Colombia was the first country in Latin America, or the second one, I'm not sure, the first democracy in Latin America. So for us, it was very important to cultivate leadership and democratic values. So when I started, I was trying to observe what already existed, and this was this UNESCO experience. And there was this wonderful rural teacher working in a demonstration school with a unitary school UNESCO experience, but it was too much work. Teachers had to make their own learning personalized cards, and teachers were unionized against this. So it was not possible to really impact national policy. And I was really aware that anything we started, I wanted it to be a national policy, that the local innovation really would impact at the national level. So I started working with this rural teacher, seeing the difficulties they were having, seeing the problems they were having in the classroom. So it was like a little bit of research, not a systematic research, but I was doing a lot of, especially learning from the rural teachers themselves. So I think the first thing I did that was good was bring him into the picture with me. I started working with a wonderful rural teacher. And of course, at that moment, I also had another person that was just came for 1 year. She was a USAID advisor, technical advisor, Beryl Levinger. So she was so wonderful. She was a Peace Corps member, and she started, helping us out. So we really started seeing how to innovate and introduce this innovation in the system. Beryl was with us the first year, then she left. But one thing for sure is that we designed, it took us like 3 years, like a 2 years and a half, 3 years to really design the intervention, because we wanted it to become a national policy. So the first thing that I wanted to keep in mind is that anything we designed from the outset was viable technically speaking, that any teacher could do it. We cannot find a PhD in remote areas of Colombia. So it was technically, politically feasible, because we have strong unions in Latin America, and you have to work with teachers. Technically, politically, and financially, was that it could be cost effective, because we wanted to impact national policy. So that's the first thing we had to consider, that this design really could impact. So what did we try to do? The first thing was nothing new in the principles of the philosophy of education, Kurt. Active child-centered learning, nothing new. All the things that Maria Montessori, John Dewey, Vygotsky said so many years ago, all these are wonderful pedagogues inspired. It's nothing new, but we just wanted to put it in practice, because these ideas came to Latin America, to the elite schools, but not to the poorest of the poor. So we wanted really to transform all this complexity into simple, manageable action, so that we could start working with the rural teachers. And I think we managed to have an intervention that was systemic, because we wanted to have an active child, a stronger participation, good citizen. But we also had to think of changing the way of working with the teachers, of changing the way of working with the parents and the community, of changing the way of working with the administrators, which was the toughest part. But we managed to, from the outset, design a systemic intervention. So we started first in a pilot number of schools. And you said, how long did it take? Well, I followed David Corton's strategy of, how do you go to scale? And I learned from him. I was inspired by him. The first thing you have to demonstrate is that what you're doing is effective, that there's a fit between what you propose and the beneficiaries. So that's the first thing we did. So the first stage was, designing it, piloting it in 3 regions of Colombia. And of course, having research behind. I think that's the only thing I have left of me being a sociologist, is that I value the importance of empirical data. So we had data that was important, demonstrating that, yes, we could have results, not only in academic achievement, but in self-esteem of children. So we started, having demonstration schools, because we wanted to have other teachers come and see, and to have demo schools where they could say, we can do this, because changing teachers' attitudes is not easy, and especially in Latin America. And unfortunately, faculties of education and teachers' colleges, they're so academic and so theoretical. And our poor teachers, all they learn is how to talk, and talk in a difficult way. But they don't have the concrete strategies on the house. So we wanted to concentrate on the house. So we started locally within a pilot school, demonstrating that that the model was working, the Escuela Nueva. And as I mentioned, it's nothing new. It was good child-centered learning. Not all children learn the same thing at the same time, and more in a multi-grade setting. So we necessarily had to think of self-paced learning, personalized learning. But we wanted children to learn to dialogue among themselves, and to look into their eyes, not their necks. So we wanted children to dialogue, and we had to promote construction of knowledge among children, and the children would construct knowledge among their dialoguing process. And this also included a change of the role of the teacher. We needed a teacher to be a mentor, to have more time to be a mentor and an orientator than a transmitter of instruction. So all these problems, and we wanted the parents to participate, and we had to think, how can we have parents in rural isolated communities participate in the learning process? So here's where we had to think of the house. And I think this was the most important part. We demonstrated that, yes, it can be done. And we first started learning to be effective. Once we demonstrated and we had schools so the teachers could see these schools, then we started gradual expansion. We wanted to demonstrate effective, first that it would be effective, then that it would be efficient. Because the first years were like 2.5 or 3 years designing it and piloting it and having data and having results. And then we gradually expanded. And then after 3 years of having proven that we had results and children were learning better and their self-esteem was improved, then we were ready to universalize it. And
so
then,
I think we'll stop at phase 1, and then Chris is going to ask a question, and we'll get to phase 2 next. But I want to clarify something. I introduced it as a 3-decade-long. This is more than 3 decades. You're in your 4th decade of working on this. So you've got a long history to share with us, and we have an hour, so I'll make sure we start getting some questions. Chris, you want to jump in here, and then we'll go back to her explanation of the evolution of it.
Well, I think for people who are interested in emulating what you've done, either by working with you or by starting something similar, a related model in their own country, there's a couple things that you said that were really important. One of them is that you started with a rural teacher as your partner. In other words, you didn't bring in somebody from Harvard as your partner. You didn't grab an urban teacher that had won a lot of awards in Columbia as your partner. You started with somebody that was a rural teacher, so had credibility with rural teachers, and somebody who I'm sure was doing a wonderful job with the children and deeply understood how to help children in the particular context that you were trying to help. And that gets me to the second point, which is again and again, what we see is a deficit model. So people say, oh, they're these poor rural children and teachers. They don't know much of anything. We're going to come in and fix them, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, multi-graded learning, as you know, is something that Montessori championed. And now there's a lot of people in psychology and education who are recognizing the strengths, maybe not of all 12 grades together, but at least, bands of 3 in developing children. So reinforcing the idea that a deficit model is wrong, these teachers actually, in some ways, were doing more effective teaching than the teachers winning the awards in Columbia with an industrial era school model. So I'm curious as to your response to that, whether I'm reading this correctly or whether I've misstated what you were doing.
Totally. The first thing I thought was, the first thing is to work with the rural teachers, because they are the ones that know what is happening on the ground and build from what they have. So I think this was the starting point, and I think this was wonderful, because I not only started with one rural teacher, but it was with a team of rural teachers that I worked with. And actually, I was very young. I was at that moment, I was in the Ministry of Education, and there was this bias, that everybody has to work with people that have PhDs. No, I wanted to work with the rural teachers themselves. So, sometimes even people laughed a little bit at me, and I had to go through all these processes. But it was interesting how to start, and I wanted to have demonstration schools where I could take all these bureaucrats so they could see something was happening on the ground, and with measurement behind, because this was important. We needed to have evidence always. And I think that's one of the reasons why Escuela Nueva has been one of the longest innovations that has been sustained, is because there's always been data and research behind demonstrating results, not only in academic achievement, but in social emotional aspects also, not only the mind, but the hearts. And so here we're also incorporating the importance of social emotional learning.
So we've got Punya's going to jump in here with a question. And I've got a couple of comments and a question. Punya, you want to jump in?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you again, Vicky, for joining us today. Just really excited to have you here in this conversation. So I have a couple, but let me start with one. I mean, like you said, I mean, these are ideas that, that Dewey talked about and others have talked about. What do you think set it apart that, a lot of people have tried things like this at the scale that you have been working in? Apart from the points that I think that Chris made, which is starting with the rural teacher and so on, what were some of the things that you think that led to the success of this, as opposed to while there are so many sort of, you're driving by educational reform, there are wreckages everywhere. And then what sort of set it apart? I'm just curious to get your perspective on that.
I think the strength of Escuela Nueva is that it's simple, it's scalable, impactful, and replicable, easily replicable, because that's what we wanted to focus on. Something that we could transform all this complexity into simple, manageable action. And as I mentioned, it's a little bit like the story of Cinderella. We started with the poorest schools, the most remote schools, but we had to rethink everything in a systemic way. And we ended up talking about the school of the future, which is what everybody's talking about right now. Nothing new of child-centered learning, but at the same time, new role of the teacher, personalized learning, cooperative learning, participation of parents in the learning process. But we wanted to focus on the hows. So when we started demonstrating these things in concrete schools, teachers could immediately say, I can do that. Because I think one of the things we focused on more was on the attitudinal change of teachers. And that's gradual. Education takes time. But I think this was the most important part. It was a process where teachers' attitudes were changed and where they were the actors of change. So I think this was one of the strengths. So I think this is one of the reasons why it's still being sustained, despite that it's been so many years on the ground.
Right. So if I can ask a follow-up, because one of the things that happens particularly when you start scaling, you lead to the dilution of the innovation. It mutates and it changes. And in some ways that's a positive because you want it to be contextual. But at another level, it also leads to a regression back to sort of standard practices and so on. So I think this is asking sort of two questions. The one is how do you maintain fidelity to that original vision while you're scaling, yet being sensitive to context? And the second is that the sustainability piece of it, that how do you prevent it from regressing back to sort of more traditional grammars of schooling that we are all sort of used to, and innovations sort of fade away and a few years later, you're back doing the same old thing.
So the first question, Panya, is repeat the question again.
It's scaling and not diluting the vision.
Okay.
And the second one
exactly.
is sustainability.
Yes. Okay. So the scaling up process. Yes. One of the issues was we wanted it to become a national policy, and we worked within the official system, which is very tough. It's very difficult. But we managed to have the results and to have impact, and always demonstrating some results. But then what happened? Once it became a national policy, then many other countries came to Colombia to start seeing it. So I started moving internationally and sending teachers abroad and starting Escuela Nueva in other Latin American countries. So what happened in Colombia? Colombia, like the rest of Latin America, started to become decentralized. So the emphasis of the reforms were in Latin America were administrative, not pedagogical. Escuela Nueva is a pedagogical reform. So everybody was focusing on the administrative parts, on learning how to decentralize, how to handle the money, and everybody forgot the pedagogy. And once it became a national policy and I was starting to move it internationally, I said, oh no, they're going to ruin it. And actually, it started falling down. It started falling down. So one of the reasons why I created an NGO was because I said, no, I have to create an NGO. We cannot let the Escuela Nueva fade in Colombia. Being born in other countries, but in Colombia becoming fading away. So we created the Fundación Escuela Nueva, which is a small NGO I'm heading right now. And because we wanted to, one, ensure the quality. We wanted to make sure that what the state was doing with Escuela Nueva was correct, to maintain the quality. So this was our role. We wanted to jump into the picture to make sure that things were done in the right way, because to avoid this dilution. The second thing we wanted to ensure was that it was easily replicable. That teachers could say, yes, we can do this. So I think when you start bottom up, then you have a lot of engines moving, And so I created this NGO, and we started trying to, let's say, influence in the ministry to ensure the quality of the and we also wanted to innovate more, because Colombia became urbanized like most other countries in Latin America. So we adapted Escuela Nueva, which started in the rural multigrade. We adapted it to urban schools. Of course, the necessity was more in the rural areas, but we wanted to show that it also could be done in the urban area. So we called it Escuela Activa Urbana. And then we started getting a lot of displaced children because of armed conflict, and of a lot of migrant children from Venezuela. So we created a new program we have right now, which is called Escuela Nueva Learning Circles, which is for migrant and displaced populations. So we've had, like little children of Escuela Nueva for rural, urban, and displaced and migrant. So we've been working on that. And of course, we have learned that you have to bring in the private sector also. You have to work with governments. I think I can summarize that you have to work with governments if you want to have impact and coverage. But you need the role of civil society, for example, our NGO, and other institutions from the private sector for two key words: for quality and for sustainability. If I had not created our NGO, everybody would have said, "Oh, Escuela Nueva, perfect. They already universalized primary education, and that's it." No, but we continue to move forward. So this richness between civil society and government and private sector, I think it has been very important for us.
So Punya's got another question, and Chris wants to jump in first. So Chris and then Punya.
So Vicky, I have done a lot of work with scaling up. And in fact, we had an episode where two of my colleagues who also have done a lot of work with scaling up talked about strategies. And what you do is such a wonderful case. You could teach the whole course without using a second case, because everything that you describe is exactly the kinds of things that we talk to people who want to scale something about. And, so using the NGO to get fidelity. It's wonderful. I'm thinking I can use your description in this episode when I teach about scale to illustrate how successful innovators think about scale. But I do want to make one point that relates to something that we've talked about on this show before. My late colleague Clay Christensen talked about disruptive innovation, and he first studied disruptive innovation in a business setting, but then brought it into education with mixed results. I don't think that he got everything right, but he got a lot of it right. And the core principle of disruptive innovation is similar to what you said at the beginning, when you said these schools were invisible. You start with a population that's not served, but nobody cares. Nobody cares, and so you can do whatever you want. And so you do whatever you want, and you build a model outside of the regular model, and it gets better and better and better and better. And all of a sudden, people realize, wow, this is better than the traditional model. We should start doing this instead. And that's what disrupts the current model. If you had begun by saying, I'm going to take an urban school, highly regulated by the ministry, and I'm going to bring in all these ideas, you and I both know what would have happened. So to anyone watching who wants to scale and wants to use disruptive innovation to scale, looking for that neglected group of people who need learning, but aren't getting it through the traditional system, and working outside of the system to get it going is such an effective way to do things. So I just want to say, that you really, whether or not you think of yourself that way, you are an expert on how to scale
I guess what I learned as a sociologist is how to beat the system.
So, Vicky, I'm going to take a slightly different tack question here, and let me give a little bit of context. This is something that I'm like very interested in, is this idea of sort of leadership driven by a core sense of values that you bring to the work that you do. In fact, I did a podcast a couple of years ago speaking with educational leaders, and you would have been a perfect guest for that podcast. I had funding for just 7 episodes, so it stopped there. And it is this sort of deep knowledge of systems and people, because I'm just thinking you make it sound so easy, honestly. But you're dealing with state bureaucracies. You're dealing with systems, multiple systems, which are often at odds with each other, people with private agendas, people who will be questioning your agendas. So I really want to understand, like, how you navigate those pieces. I mean, and it's a little bit of a personal question in the sense of like how you developed both that sort of a value system and how that then helps you navigate these, because I know I can see these meetings in my mind's eye where people are resistant because they think, who is this person coming in? What do they know? Are they trying to show off? Are they trying to destroy? Are they after power? I mean, it's a really complicated thing, and I love how easy you make it sound.
It's not easy, Panya. It's not easy.
I know it is not. So I would love to understand how what you bring to that, the resilience and the so on. Like, what are the strategies? Because I puzzle with that all the time. I struggle with that personally in my job all the time. So it's a very selfish question in some ways.
Well, in a way, when you have to handle bureaucracy, you just need a lot of patience, Panya, and persistence, and a lot of persistence. So it's not easy at all. It's very tough to deal with bureaucrats, and especially when, they say, who's this lady, what's this NGO, moving all these schools and running around with all these rural teachers. But I think one of the best elements we've had to support all this is because the teachers are on our side. The actors of change have been the same teachers. So, when people wanted to have, to understand this, they would see all these motivated teachers really loving Escuela Nueva, seeing that it was something that responded and that really helped them. It was not a burden for them, but it was some help. And they, we never left the teachers alone. By the way, I can share a little bit more details of not only what happens at the classroom, but on the house. We maintain all these teachers, this network of teachers. So we just had to sort of survive the ministries of education, survive the bureaucracies, survive the decentralization process in the region, but also start getting other types of partners on the ground that have certain respectability. So, for example, at this moment, this is just recent, I have partnered with a petroleum company of Colombia, okay? And they're very prestigious, except right now that, the whole discussion of the issues of petroleum and all this. But they've been a wonderful partner, because then we have gone in remote areas of Colombia jointly with them. The same thing happened with the coffee growers. So I started looking into private sector and civil society. And of course, with the local governments, because you cannot do anything in Colombia in the schools unless you have the government or the local government on board. They're the owners of the schools. So we cannot get into the schools without their permission. But we've managed to, bring into the picture and bring all these actors together. So I think it's just a lot of persistence, a lot of patience, and bringing other actors in. So, for example, when, once the World Bank had selected Escuela Nueva as an innovation that had impacted successfully national policy, many countries came here. And I started sending Colombian teachers abroad to countries like Vietnam. I mean, a country like Vietnam is very, very, very special, because they came, and the Vietnamese, they've done it better than us in Colombia, much better, because they took the political decision, and they have Escuela Nueva in all the rural schools in Vietnam. Of course, and an impact evaluation already came out. Of course, this was with support of the World Bank. So I think this is important also, just having evidence in other places to demonstrate that, look, it's our Colombian innovation, and look how it's moving in different parts. So I think this has brought in a lot of motivation for the teachers, and feeling them as actors of change themselves. So I think this has been positive. So it's more like a movement right now than any other thing.
Thank you.
We all have to kind of bow in your presence here, because we talk to a lot of people week in and week out about local change. But you've taken that on a global stage and made a huge impact to countless lives of people you'll never meet. But you must have some real satisfaction in your career path that you've taken, moving from sociology and getting involved in sociology of education, in effect, and curriculum programming and so forth. I'm kind of curious. I have two questions. I'm going to ask the second one first, because it will help us extend your story a little bit and the way you started with us here, giving us phase one. But I want to get us a little bit into phase two, because the program has moved internationally. So I'd like for you to discuss where, besides Vietnam and Colombia, some other places where it's been implemented. So if our listeners are in different countries, they might be able to relate to where it has taken place. But as part of that, I'd like you to also talk about what happens if this is primarily a primary program. What happens at the middle school and high school level if they aren't implementing the components or the principles, and the kids have gone through 6 or 8 years and have really captivated with a child-centered approach. And then all of a sudden they find themselves moving out of the Escuela Nueva school, the new school, into the old school. What happens when they move into the old school? And the third part of that, is there differential, you kind of alluded to this, the answer is yes, differential application. It sounds like people, take your principles and apply them based on social and cultural norms, expectations, backgrounds, and so forth. So kind of a complicated question, but it really takes us on a journey of what's happened after phase one, and how do you deal with the nuances across age groups and as students progress?
Well, precisely one of the reasons why we had to start moving it up to 9th grade, we went beyond primary education and we're already into secondary education, is because many of these children had left this system, and they would clash with a traditional, conventional way of learning. So we started, children themselves forced us to incorporate it into secondary education. And we're right now moving into secondary education because the children themselves made the change. Okay, that's one. Second, we have a lot of testimonies now, trying to collect a lot of testimonies, because we do get a lot of, wonderful feedback from, I was a student in Escuela Nueva, and thanks to this, I am a person that has self-esteem and I can talk in public and I can do this, So you hear these wonderful testimonies. We're trying to gather more testimonies. Now, in relation to other countries, I mean, the news is not so good, and I think there are lessons learned. Once the World Bank, had selected Escuela Nueva, many countries came into Colombia, like 40 countries have come into Colombia to get inspired in Escuela Nueva. And then we have an international strategy to, and prototypes to get things started. However, my big mistake was I started everything only with governments. So I started mainly with governments. From Peru, we've had like 40 visits from Peruvian government in the last years. I mean, from all Latin America. And I started sending Colombian teachers. You go to Mexico, you go to Guatemala, you go to Brazil, Escuela Activa. And we started creating, with the support of international organizations behind, because I did have the support of UNICEF, USAID, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, because we were having results, measurable results. So it was a successful experience. So, many countries wanted it, and we started pilots in many countries. But that was a mistake. I should have, since the beginning, have worked not only with the government, but have had private sector or civil society on the ground also. If I would have had a partner from the private sector or from civil society, things would have been sustained. Why? Because when you work only with governments, we started working only with the Peruvian government, only with the Mexican government, they change every 6 months. So nothing can be sustained and nothing can continue. So I learned too late. It was too late. I should have started in Brazil, with the government in Brazil, but also somebody from private sector. In Mexico, I already learned a little bit. I tried to, I selected TV Azteca because, the government, the bureaucracy is so complicated. So I learned it too late. So now every time I go into a country, the first thing I do is, what other actors are there? Because I need to have other partners on the ground because the government is going to change. Okay. So innovation started by governments will not be sustained too long. That's an issue. So you have to suffer through this, and you just have to learn how to survive, with a lot of patience and a lot of persistence. But once it becomes a movement, and you have the support of the teachers and they feel happy with what they're doing, you cannot erase it just like that. And I still have teachers writing me from Brazil, writing me from Paraguay. When can we continue? We love the experience, But then the first thing I'm finding out is who else is there from the private sector that could help us out, because only with the government is not enough.
So I have 2 words before Punya jumps in here. Maybe Chris and Punya will have 2 words as well before Punya's question. Fascinating. It's just, that really is all of that. I mean, just how you're able to administer this program on a global scale, and yet still on a local scale at the same time. It's got to be daunting at times, but so fulfilling at the same time.
But it's also depressing when you say, oh my God, it's so much bureaucracy and nothing happens with them. Well, this small NGO started it. So, you have to have all these partners on the ground, not only one, but all of them.
That even just that, thinking about who the possible partners can be, broadening your mindset or your perspective of how to implement such a program, and realizing that government officials come and go, and the other stakeholders you have to engage, or it's going to fail. Punya, you have your question. You want to come in here?
Sure, thank you. And again, thank you for all your insights and sharing your experiences. So we are all, faculty in colleges of education. So one of the things we do is teacher preparation.
Oh my God.
So if you are, trying to build this new teacher at some level, that's what you're doing. What has been your experience in working with teacher prep programs who are in their own way, they usually talk the talk, but they don't walk the walk, so you will have, so I always joke about, a person giving a lecture on constructivism, like everybody,
that's all they do here.
Yeah, perfect, right? That's like the ultimate in irony, right? So I'm just curious about sort of in the professional development of teachers, I'm guessing that a lot of it is done internally within the schools as a way of inculcating into that culture. So I would like to understand that a little better, if you could speak to that. But the other is partnering our teacher education programs and so on, partners with you, so that the teachers who are coming in to your schools are actually coming in prepared for that. Because for many, the preparation that they're getting is not for this kind of an educational or a pedagogical system. So I'd be just curious to hear your experience about that.
Panya, and in Latin America, it's worst because we're very theoretical and very academic. So the poor teachers, I say poor teachers because they have gone through a lot of theories, constructivist theories. All they do is repeat these theories, as you mentioned. And here in Latin America, it's worst. It's really terrible. But they don't know the hows. So we really wanted to concentrate on the hows, and I think the teacher development. So most of these teachers come from teachers' colleges, or the ones that come from faculties of education. Oh, no way. They're so complicated. You know, they just learn to speak in a difficult way, we say, okay? So we wanted to change attitudes and behaviors. So the first thing, you know, I had like 3 things we had in mind when for teacher training. The first thing is we wanted that the teachers see a demo school, just so that we could initiate an attitudinal change, that they could say, oh, yes, I can do that. You know, they can get into a school and see another teacher with another colleague, same as theirs, nothing out of this world, but saying a school working with the Escuela Nueva system. So the first thing was see a demo school that they can say, I have a visual image of where I'm going to, because they have too much theory, but they don't have a visual image. The second thing was, let's train the teachers with the same methodology that they will be using with their students. Because, you know, here the poor teachers here, you know, they're asked to make the change, but they're trained in a conventional way. So all they do is talk in a difficult way. So I think that was we had to compensate for what teachers' colleges were not doing. So we trained them with the same methodology that they would be using with their children. So in Escuela Nueva, children have learning guides, which are like a hybrid of a textbook and a workbook and the guide of the teacher all in one, because we had to think of cost effectiveness. But also the teacher training manual, where we train our teachers on how to implement Escuela Nueva, more on the house, is with the same methodology as the children's learning methodology. So teachers live the same process. And the third principle of our training strategy was not leave the teachers alone. Once they get started, you cannot leave them alone. So they used to come together in teachers' learning circles once every month and share among themselves what they were doing, because we learned that teachers learn more from other teachers than from experts. So we started to create a community of practice. And with the COVID situation, which I want to share a little bit of what happened, because we don't have connectivity in rural areas. Children do not have connectivity. In all Latin America, there's no connectivity in rural areas. So our children continue with their learning materials. I can talk about our learning guides a little bit more in detail, because they're self-paced learning materials, printed for children. But the teachers are in these towns, they do have connectivity. Children in rural areas do not, but the teachers that live in the smaller towns, they do have. So we brought the teachers' learning circles together, and during the COVID situation, this was the starting point of our virtual campus. And we have a virtual campus called Renueva, which means renewal. It's very, very simple, very small. And our teachers in rural teachers are very shy to use technology. But with the COVID situation, it was fantastic, because they really were enthusiastic. They got into it. And we've been training teachers jointly with the Ministry of Education virtually in the most remote areas of Colombia. And it has been very successful. So we demonstrated that, yes, it can be done. And so I think these are the things that we never left the teachers alone. So they're part of a community of practice right now. It's called Renueva, renewal, because they learn more from other teachers. And I think this is one of the strengths. So we do have a community of practice at this moment. Not as strong as we would like it to be, but it's starting to move forward. And I think that's important. So those 3 things for teacher training.
Thank you. So what I really like about what you said, and that resonates really with my own experience, is one of the things that, you know, psychological research actually shows is that if you want to change people's beliefs, that you actually first change their behaviors before you change their beliefs. We try to change people's beliefs and think that that will impact behavior. Actually, it's the other way around.
I think it was the other way around.
Right. So what you're doing is, when you're putting teachers in that space of learning, in that process that you espouse, then the value of it happens, and then the mindset change. Exactly. But if we lecture them about the mindset, then it is just somebody telling you more, and it is not experiential in nature. So it really resonates. I mean, that's sort of the philosophy that, I've applied in all the work that I do in teacher professional development, is actually throw them in actual real situations, create context where they're engaging with learning the way you want them to, and then have a moment of reflection, like, why did that work? And then the implied question is, why aren't you doing that with your kids? And and that automatically happens. So thank you for that. So I'm going to leave it to whoever, Kurt or Chris, has a question or comment.
Chris will often talk about dispositions in addition to perceptions. Chris was going to jump in, I think, and say that. Chris, you want to make a point there?
Well, I think that often we focus too much on knowledge and skills in education without also considering dispositions. And you brought that out when you talked about how important tenacity is and how important resilience is. If you want to be a successful innovator, you just can't give up. You have to keep going. When confronted with lemons, you figure out how to make lemonade, and so on. And I think that when you describe extended opportunities for teachers to watch other teachers, part of what they're learning is dispositions. Dispositions are not something that you see instantly, the way that you can see a teacher demonstrate a skill or see a teacher show that they have a piece of knowledge. Dispositions refer to patterns over time. And so if you see a teacher not give up on a child because it's hard to reach them, but keep trying and trying and trying from different directions until they find the key, you're learning something about a disposition that the teachers need to have. So I don't know if you think about it through that lens, but I'm curious as to whether that resonates with you and with your experiences.
Totally, Chris, totally. Dispositions, positive attitude, and that they see things working in action, not leave them alone, Now, one question that I think, I don't know who made it, but in relation to certification in the future, this is a challenge we have right now. This is what I'm thinking now. We have to certify something because we have done in-service training. And then, many of the teachers are changed and new teachers come into the picture. So I think at this moment, our challenge is how can we move on into a certification program jointly with a teacher's faculty or with a university. I think that's a challenge we have right now for the next step. But in the meanwhile, we've just been doing in-service training. Now, in relation to, I think, a question that was asked at the beginning, that Kurt, I think, asked me, how many countries? Well, it has inspired many educational reforms from Latin America. We had Escuela Nueva in many countries, but then it's not sustained because of the change of governments, okay? So that's the problem. So here's where my reflection was, you need to work with the government, but you need to bring another partner on the ground if you want it to be to be sustained, and if you're to ensure quality control. So I guess there are some things that we've learned positively, and other things that we've learned, the wrong way, but that it sort of reconfirms things that we already are talking about.
So, my class this semester is on designing learning environments, my R626 class, and I have them watching these videos every week as part of their assignments, and they have to design their ideal learning environment as a final project. And so I came with the intention of asking you, what are the principles of this program? But you've answered that already. You've laid them out. And so people watching this, and it won't just be my students at Indiana, there's students in Maryland, there's students in other states that are watching this as well. My challenge to all of you who are watching the show later or listening to it while you're walking or running, think of all the principles that Vicky's laid out during this hour. And then, think of what principles you deem to be valuable in your ideal learning environment, and see if there's a match and what kind of match there is. And so I was thinking back to graduate school, or right after graduate school. Not graduate school it was, when Tharp and Gallimore's book came out, Rousing Minds to Life, their award-winning book. And the Kamehameha schools in Hawaii. because when you started off talking about principles, democracy and collaboration and self-directedness and all these other things, you also added in this component of conversation and dialogue.
Oh, yeah.
And what Tharp and Gallimore found in studying these Hawaiian children was the conversations that were taking place, the stories. Exactly. The culture is all story-based, and you have to start with the stories of their own roots, where they're coming from, before you go anywhere else. And so while Punya was asking a question, or Chris was, I went online to look at what the components are of they have created an approach called the instructional conversation, which is not a prescriptive model. And my real criticism of most instructional design theories is they're based on very prescriptive, the Dick and Carey model, or whatever models are out there, the Addy model. They're very prescriptive in nature. Anyways, the instructional conversation is a teacher facilitated project where you build on prior background knowledge of students, where multiple ideas are encouraged and developed, where there's fewer black and white responses, and there's guided discovery approaches, or guided understanding.
That's it.
And all that. They got more things, giving them feedback when needed, encouraging different ideas. But they do also include a component of direct instruction. So they haven't totally flipped the model. They've embedded many components to activate schemas and to promote student collaboration and listening and all this in a non-threatening atmosphere. Anyone watching the show, look up instructional conversation, Tharp and Gallimore. Did you read Tharp and Gallimore when you were designing your model?
No, not at all. I think you have all the theory. I don't have the theory. But I think what we did was, bottom up and try to solve problems. So we wanted children to learn to dialogue. I think that learning to dialogue among themselves is so important for peace processes. And so our learning guides, our materials, they could be a little bit prescriptive from your perspective, but teachers don't have time, unless in a multi-grade school, don't have time for planning wonderful lesson plans every day. So the learning guide is a lesson plan, but directed to the children with the intelligent questions. And it's dialoguing textbooks. Learning guides are dialoguing textbooks, because they're always children who are always dialoguing individually, in pairs, in group, and so the learning guides are the intelligent questions that take children to higher level thinking skills, and then application of knowledge with their parents and their family and their community. So we had to make this in such a simple way, but anything the child learns can be applied with their parents. So the child becomes an agent of change in their community. And we force children to dialogue with their parents, which is something that's missing right now so strongly. So our learning guides have a little bit of venom inside, because they have a lot of things that help teachers. And the teachers do not have time to plan wonderful lesson plans. I have a booklet, and I have it here. I think it's in Spanish. It's in English. Let me show you. This is written by a former Minister of Education of Chile, ex-director of UNESCO, Ernesto Schiefelbein. He's Chilean, and he wrote this. I think it's the oldest publication we have. It was published by UNESCO and UNICEF. In Search of the School of the 21st Century, is the Colombian Escuela Nueva the right pathfinder? He wrote this 30 years ago or longer time ago. I want to share it with you because it's so simple. So simple and so well written. I think our things are too complicated sometimes, but this was so interesting, and especially being a person from not Colombia, from Chile. So I think that was also support. And another thing that I learned to little tricks to survive. I think you have to learn to be resilient. The first time we published something, the first evaluation we had, a solid evaluation we had of Escuela Nueva, I asked the University of London, the Institute of Education, Angela Little, a good friend of mine who has done a lot of publications on rural schools, multi-grade schools all over the world. She published our first evaluation in her book. I'll share all this later on. So for me, it was so important because we published it first at the University of London, so the people here at the national universities could believe what we were saying, because that's another thing. You need international academic support even before you have the local support. Unfortunately, in Latin America, we produce too much poetry, not enough science. Okay, and that in a way is good, but we, our faculties of education, there's not much empirical research behind. So just having the Institute of Education, the University of London, publishing our evaluations was something that for me was strategic, because in this way I could show the people here, look at what the University of London, they published this, and we don't even know what it says, because in our faculties of education, they're just learning how to talk in a difficult way. So they don't know really what's going on the ground. I'm sorry to be so harsh.
No, I completely hear you. And I just want to, coming back to my original question about sort of how you play that game strategically, that's like a great example of saying the only way that I will gain credibility in this space is if London comes in and says that we are doing good work. And, so that's the kind of thing which is like you are thinking 2 steps ahead of how to make the case, not just by sort of doing the good work and hoping that'll happen, but sort of building other, elements into that and bringing other people into that conversation. So, yeah.
Panya is learning how to survive.
So I'm wondering.
That's perfect. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions before we end. I might be able to ask one of them before we end, maybe both. But Chris, it looks like you have a question you want to jump in here.
Well, I just want to comment that how important it is that you have a policy background and that you understand how policymakers think about these things, because if you don't understand every part of the system, then you can't change the system. And a lot of innovators are really, really good up to the level of entire school districts. But then when they get higher than that, it starts to fall apart because they don't understand how policymakers think and what their reward structures are and how to pitch to them doing something different. So I think, again, that's another important part of the recipe, that it's because of the many roles that you've played that you're able to be successful in changing a system. So Kurt, back to you.
Sure, and I have 2 things, and I'll put both of them forward here. Looking back, were there things that failed, that you gave up on, or you had to significantly change? Looking ahead, are there things you have left to do? And we'll end with that 2-parted question.
Yes, things we left behind. We should have focused a little bit more on reading and writing strategies, because our self-paced learning materials start in 2nd grade, and usually these children in these poor environments, they don't have kinder 3, kinder 4, kinder 5, before getting into their 1st grade. They actually stay 2 years in the 1st grade because they haven't had any previous type of preschool. So if we had some more support and more clarity on reading and writing skills for the 1st grade, I think that's very important. That's crucial, because sometimes teachers in a multi-grade setting, they have to spend so much time with the 1st graders. And this is why the other grades have to be a little bit more autonomous, more independent type of work with the self-paced learning materials. So I think maybe for the 1st grade, that would have been an issue. That would have been very important. And I think another thing, with the rural teachers, if we would have started with some accreditation program, because here permanently teachers are being transferred. So it's like planting in a river. So here you train teachers, in-service training, you train teachers, and then you've trained the teacher, and then they change the teacher. So a new teacher comes into the picture. So what happens? The child trains the teacher, okay? So this is an issue that we have to see how we can handle it with a certification program of some sort, because this is a problem we face permanently. Now, I would love to see how I can link with some university, ideally, because this would immediately bring a lot of the teachers to ensure that they're going to get some type of certification. This would be just fantastic. So we didn't think about this at the beginning, unfortunately.
And looking ahead, any grants in the process right now? Anything that you're waiting to hear back on that will enhance or improve the program?
That we didn't do that we could have done?
that you might do next, or that you recommend to the other Escuela Nueva schools, what they might do?
Yes, for sure. Well, now we're our challenges now are with let's say with the new technologies. Definitely, that's a challenge. Despite children do not have connectivity in rural areas, that the teachers do, and we're learning how to use it with our virtual campus, and that's been successful. But we definitely need to, a little bit more of learning more of these technological issues. And the other thing is, why not from south to north? But I mean, some developed countries have asked us to do things with them, and why not? So this is something that I think would be very interesting for us and for the self-esteem of our teachers. Just to think that something happens from south to north. That would be very interesting.
Well, our listeners might be contacting you. So I believe in our blog post for this week, I included Vicky's email in there. If not, write to me and I will get it for you if you want to make a connection or a potential partnership with Vicky Colbert and the Escuela Nueva schools. This has been a fascinating session. We should have held this in week one, actually. It would have been a springboard for many other shows because this is ground zero. You've been at ground zero and moved to ground 1,000.
What I need is a Kurt, a Chris, and a Panya helping me out theoretically with all the things that we've been doing empirically.
We just might. That might be our next paper or project or something that we write. And, again, I applaud your efforts and I bow in your presence because you've done and continue to do fascinating work. I repeat, fascinating. Vicky, thank you so much for being with us today. Chris is going to introduce the next show.
So Vicky, again, thank you. And South to North has been a big theme of Silver Lining for Learning. We've celebrated so many educators doing wonderful things who no one knows about, but we're trying to highlight what they have to contribute. So next week is back to our 5:30 time slot. It's back to streaming the show, which we weren't able to do this week. And it's a chance for the hosts to reflect. And we've had such interesting shows recently that I think we'll have a rich set of things to reflect on. So hope to see you next week. Silver Lining for Learning.